Okay, next up, we have got Elizabeth May. I mean, the Green Party looks absolutely foolish now. They're kind of a joke, and I have to say, um, either she talks in this lecture here about the Kyoto Protocol, um, and either it was envisioned at the beginning, but there's definitely people there that really believe in it and are genuine. But I think given in 2023, we can see that the green movement in Europe, the Kyoto Protocol, the whole climate change narrative, and reducing carbon emissions is a Trojan horse for authoritarian control, and maybe even a significant amount of people with the control in the movement have an agenda of depopulation. And I don't know, coming from Europe, this is, I can think of some other movements that came out in the 30s and 40s that were all about depopulation. And frankly, I think that's evil. So, but, given that, okay, you'll see right when she says at the beginning here, she has a romantic moment about being in Metro Toronto Convention Center in an environmental meeting in '88, which I suspect, although she kind of doesn't, she says it was about carbon, but I don't think it was. I think it might have been one of the follow up meetings to the Montreal Protocol, which was finalized in 1987, and now that was a global crisis that all countries around the world got mobilized on, and they removed. I remember this as a child. They removed the use of chlorofluorocarbons because they had seen very large openings in the ozone layer, which limits ultraviolet rays, so that life can actually exist on the Earth, and that was global effort, and it's gone. They never talk about it now, but the ozone layer now is largely repaired thanks to that protocol and the action on that. And it seems like she might have actually played a role in that when she mentions that in '88. Um, but in any case, she's talking more about the Kyoto stuff now and carbon. And okay, so I listened to her talk. I really wanted to hear that she sounded like a fool, but she does not. She Elizabeth May is a competent lady, genuine to some degree, but note she still is a politician. And you got to stick for the. There's one question at the end, and it's a good question. It gets right to the point, and you can see her here in her answers and her rationalizations. Like she knows that the Kyoto Protocol is flawed. It's kind of pointless if India, China, and Russia are not in it. And Canada's impact in carbon emissions is like 2% of the world. It doesn't really matter. But she also talks about capping uh, emissions, and I kind of like the idea of capping emissions. Honestly, not this reduction of carbon, but the idea of capping emissions. That is not a depopulation kind of thing. What we can do to get more out of the carbon we're using is focus on efficiency, right? Rather, and her, like, she does make a number of micro points, which I think are all very good, valid ones. So she still has something to contribute in this, I have to say. Although like the Kyoto Protocol is just awful, and as I said, I'm not going to repeat myself, but so there's definitely stuff to pick out of this, and it, of course, again, it still is relevant today, 20 years later. Yeah. So that's all. That's all I got to say about this now.
Is a graduate of Dalhousie Law School and was admitted to the bar in Nova Scotia and Ontario. She has held the position of Associate General Counsel for the Public Interest Advocacy Centre, representing consumer, poverty, and environmental groups in her work. She is the author of 4 books, her latest 2, At the Cutting Edge, The Crisis in Canada's Forests, and her most recent, co-authored with Maud Barlow, Frederick Street, Life and Death on Canada's Love Canal. Elizabeth May is Executive Director of the Sierra Club of Canada, a member of the Board of Directors of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and is the former vice chair of the National Roundtable for the Environment and Economy. She was the first chairholder of the Elizabeth May Chair in Women's Health and Environment at Dalhousie University. She is the recipient of several awards and sits on numerous boards. With her experience and knowledge, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Elizabeth May.
Thanks, Kim. I'm wondering if I can ask whoever's in charge of the lights to bring them down a bit, because I like to be able to at least maybe see some of the people in the room with me. So maybe we'll see how that goes. That's nicer. Thank you. A little more, a little more. I hope you guys don't mind, but it's nicer not to be blinded. Thank you, and I do want to thank the organizers of this conference, the Conference on Unity, Sovereignty, and Prosperity, for inviting me to participate and for giving me the honor of serving as a sponsor. I think this is a very good approach to a conference, that those of us who come because we believe in the goals. I particularly want to thank Paul Hellyer for his leadership role in so many issues and in bringing people together around important themes about the future of this country. Yes, I think so. A little word about Sierra Club of Canada, since we're all here and people often don't know who or what we are. Just to let you know that if you're interested in finding out more about Sierra Club or about the topic I'm addressing today about Kyoto, there is material in the literature and book room downstairs. I'd urge you to pick something up. And I also would be very grateful if you generally support our goals or think, gee, they do good work, I notice them in the media. Be very grateful if you'd consider joining. We don't do direct mail. You'll never get anything through your door slot from us asking you to join, so you have to go a little out of your way downstairs, pick up a membership form, and join that way. The topic that we have before us in these next 2 days of unity, and basically the overriding theme that Mel Hurtig has put before us as well, of what is happening in Canada, what must Canada do to survive as an independent country. It may strike you initially that the topic I choose to address, why we must ratify Kyoto, is somehow a little different, a little off topic from the general question of how does Canada survive as an independent country. What does unity, sovereignty, and prosperity have to do with Kyoto? And the case I want to put to you today is that not only is there a relationship, but that actually ratifying Kyoto is the first positive, progressive step that Canada has taken in many years to act as an independent, sovereign country and not to be pulled along in the direction the U.S. wishes us to go. It is true that Kyoto addresses the single largest environmental threat that we face today. It's actually somewhat nostalgic for me to be speaking to you in this convention center. The last time I was part of any convention that was organized in this space, it was in June 1988. I was on the staff of the Federal Minister of Environment at the time, the Honourable Tom McMillan, and Canada hosted the first really large public international conference. Certainly there had been smaller international groupings of scientists looking at the growing threat of climate change as a result of human-caused emissions of greenhouse gases, largely from burning fossil fuels. But that first large public conference took place in this building in June 1988, and it was called The Changing Atmosphere: Implications for Global Security. I think those were interesting themes in that time. We were in the midst of a quite unprecedented heat wave in Toronto in the last week of June '88. The conference was co-sponsored by the Government of Canada and various United Nations bodies, including the World Meteorological Organization, the United Nations Environment Program, and we were addressed both by the Prime Minister of Canada and by the Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland. The consensus statement then, and I think it's not just nostalgia for me since I'm in this space, but I think I want to share with you, even given all the uncertainties in the science in 1988, and there's no question that what we know now and the nature and characteristics of our scientific knowledge of the threat of climate change is far more robust than it was in 1988. But the consensus statement of the scientists gathered in these halls in June of 1988 opened with this sentence: Humanity is conducting an unintended, uncontrolled, globally pervasive experiment whose ultimate consequences are second only to global nuclear war. That is still true today. What we are doing in emitting vast amounts of greenhouse gases, we are behaving in a very reckless way. It is best understood as an experiment which we can't control and which is globally pervasive and whose ultimate consequences are completely catastrophic. We talk about climate change, and the news media talks about climate change, and God help us, industry CEOs talk about climate change as though we knew what it was, as though we knew how to characterize its worst case outcomes. And in some cases, some politicians and some industry people are quite convinced that rich countries can just ride this out, that we really don't need to do anything because, after all, warmer winters will be nicer. One friend of mine in the Liberal caucus, I must also, while thanking people, he's gone now, but you should all know how much we owe John Godfrey. As a backbencher, as a Liberal member of caucus, he has single-handedly, in many cases, spearheaded the support for Kyoto within caucus and ensured that Jean Chrétien went to South Africa, carrying with him a mandate from his own caucus to ratify immediately and not wait for further loopholes, as Canada quite shamefully has been pushing for throughout the process. So John Godfrey, for those of you who are in his riding, good work. We're very grateful to him. Well, when we talk about what the worst outcomes of climate change can be, and I was trying to say this one MP, not John, someone else told me that he runs into people in industry who say things as ridiculous as, well, it's going to be good for Canada, don't you know, because the Northwest Passage won't have any more ice. And that's going to open up shipping opportunities, unimaginable business opportunities for Canada all around the world. We're going to be warmer, so we won't have so much cost of snow removal. It's all economic great news for us. Now, this is basically the Dr. Strangelove of climate change talking. These are people who could be clinically insane if only someone could get hold of them, and they would spill the beans that these were their deep inner thoughts. Climate change threatens our very survival on this planet. The worst case is not the one that gets talked about all the time. I'm not going to give you a long lecture on the science, but I do think it's important to know that the consensus opinion of the world's scientists, as encapsulated in something called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Advice to Policymakers, and this is something that was actually created as a result of the conference that was held here in June '88. The impetus led to the creation of a United Nations body where governments appoint their top scientists, and those scientists in turn review the evidence of peer-reviewed scientific papers from all around the world, and they include within that process those who are skeptics. They work together and they word by word, line by line, agree on advice to policymakers and a consensus statement of what's going on with the science. So by definition, the advice to policymakers from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is conservative. While many in the industry quarters would like to play up the fact that there are some uncertainties which the IPCC acknowledges, there are just as many uncertainties, and probably more, that lead in the direction of things being far worse than the consensus opinion, than those that suggest they might not be so bad. For instance, the Western Antarctic ice sheet. If the Western Antarctic ice sheet falls into the ocean, as many credible scientists whose work has appeared in peer-reviewed scientific journals believe could happen if we allow the atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide to double. If that happens, and the consensus Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change process has decided that on balance, they don't think that will happen. So that's good news. But there's quite a lot of credible scientists who think it's quite likely that it will. So it's a bit of a judgment call. That has a very significant impact on the consensus advice to policymakers of what might happen to sea level rise. Sea level rise by the end of the century, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change consensus, could be 1 to 2 meters, 3 meters. If the Western Antarctic ice shield falls into the ocean, it's 8 meters. It's a very significant difference for places like whether New York is submerged. Very significant impacts for all coastal cities. So it's not the case that listening to the consensus statement from the United Nations panel of scientists amounts to a worst-case scenario. It's certainly not the case that it amounts to scare tactics. What they have advised is that allowing atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide to double is simply dangerous. That's the word that's used. It is dangerous because it will unleash a whole range of shifts in the climate balance that have remained more or less in balance, in equilibrium, for about 20 million years. It's not to say that climate doesn't shift. Climate shifts a lot, but there has never been anything like the shifts in climate in a short period of time that we've experienced recently as a result of human interference in the climate system. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has warned us that to avoid a doubling of atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, we need to reduce greenhouse gases globally by 60 to 70%. Many of you will be aware that the Kyoto target for Canada is 6%. We must reduce, again, and repeat this, that the global scientific consensus is that to avoid levels of greenhouse gases that represent something quite dangerous, we need 70% reductions below 1990 levels. Kyoto takes us to 6% below for Canada alone. So taken out by itself, and the anti-Kyoto crowd has become expert at picking out little bits of the science and making it sound as if in isolation somehow it's an argument against ratifying. That somehow the fact, and it is a fact, that the full effect of Kyoto, if fully implemented, is to delay the doubling point of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere by 6 years. They say, well, as Rex Murphy has said, that does not do a jot for the environment. So this is not about the environment at all then, is it? This is some vast conspiracy theory of those powerful environmental groups to bring the province of Alberta's economy to its knees. It's absurd. Environmental groups have never had the kind of power to make governments do things for some ulterior, bizarre conspiracy theory motive. Governments are moving on climate change because the science is clear. Kyoto is only the first step. If all we did was Kyoto, it wouldn't make much difference. But the point about the Kyoto Protocol is it's part of a process, and I hope to explain that in political terms in the course of describing how important Canada's role in the world is in proceeding with ratification. I'd put to you that beyond climate change being the single greatest environmental threat to the planet, and also the single, other than nuclear war, quite at the moment our largest survival threat, it also is actually the single most critical issue for Canadians concerned with ensuring that Canada exists as an independent, sovereign nation and not merely as a raw material source for the energy appetite of the United States. When you look at the last decade of relationship between Canada and the U.S., as many of the speakers will do and have done, there's no question that every step has been won towards greater integration of Canada's economy with that of the United States. And this is particularly the case in terms of our energy policies. When you look at NAFTA, it's very clear that the energy chapter of NAFTA is about locking in forever Canada's role in supplying cheap oil and gas to an inexhaustible energy appetite in the United States. The energy chapter of NAFTA, for those of you who may need a quick refresher course, ensures that whatever percentage of our oil and gas that we ship south will be maintained in perpetuity. So that if Canada chooses to adopt conservation measures and drill less, refine less domestically, whatever that pie is, if the pie is shrinking, if it's 40% of our natural gas, which it is now, that goes south, then it must continue forever to go south. That's the kind of integration which is locked in to ensure that we continue to supply the United States. And one doesn't need to think too hard to imagine scenarios where we are supplying the U.S. in a way that is detrimental to our own economic activities. Now, that proportional sharing has also come at a time that we have, in the same period since NAFTA, seen an unprecedented increase in oil and gas production in Canada heading for the U.S. It's now the case that Canada ships more oil and gas to the United States than does Saudi Arabia. We are a major supplier, particularly natural gas from the East Coast region. We are shipping a lot south from places like the Athabasca tar sands, which is the most carbon-intensive form of oil that you can find anywhere on the planet. And we have sunk billions of dollars of taxpayers' money into developing that in northern Alberta. And Jean Chrétien has personally educated George Bush so that he actually can talk about the Athabasca tar sands and talks about the province of Alberta. And I'm sure that when he was elected, he'd heard of neither. So it's quite likely that we are encouraging the U.S. to understand that we'll be here forever to supply oil and gas. The pressures for production have a real immediate impact on Canada's wilderness areas and on other important economic and cultural and community activities in Canada. I recommend highly to you Andrew Nikiforik's book, Saboteur, which uses the storyline of Weibo Ludwig, but does a devastating job in critiquing what the Alberta government has given away and has sacrificed in the health of the farming communities, the health of their livestock, their own families, and the series of people and farms who have taken buyout deals and taken gag orders not to talk about the fact that the oil and gas industry is supreme in Alberta and ranks higher than any other user, and that in conflicts with ranchers, the oil and gas industry, of course, has primacy. It goes without saying that in conflicts with First Nation groups, particularly the Lubicon, who've seen their health deteriorate substantially because of the off-gassing from sour gas wells, they also rate nowhere in the system compared to the oil and gas industries. Things about the Athabasca oil sands people may not be aware of as well is how very, very intensive is that production. They need whole power plants in the tar sands to fuel the production and the cleaning up of this very dirty form of oil so that it can get to refinable commercial quality. And for every 1 barrel of oil that comes out of the Athabasca tar sands, they consume 4 barrels of water. It's a very, very energy, water, and natural resource intensive industry, and it's been heavily subsidized, and that is the key area of concern for those who are against Kyoto in Alberta, is the investments and ever-expanding investments in the tar sands. When you read between the lines, that's the investments they're worried about. We also, of course, to continue to feed the U.S. appetite, want to run pipelines through the McKenzie. There's pressure from the BC government to open up the BC coast to coastal oil and gas. Atlantic Canada is seeing an unbelievable bonanza in oil and gas companies staking out the coastlines, including areas that are of great importance to the fishing industry. We still have 20,000 fishers who make a sustainable living off the fishery just in the southern Gulf of St. Lawrence of Atlantic Canada, and they found to their horror that huge areas were already staked out to companies from Texas. The small community of Shelburne found out that El Paso Pipelines was planning to put a gas plant in their scenic fishing and tourist-dependent town to run the pipeline along the seabed and ship the gas south again. All of this pressure is to meet the Bush-Cheney energy strategy. For those of you who haven't seen it, the Bush-Cheney energy strategy is just simply summed up in one word: more. More all the time. As a matter of fact, if you look at the calculations of what they think the U.S. demand for oil and gas will be, particularly for petroleum products, for gasoline, for cars, someone did the calculation and realized that in order to actually need as much gas as Dick Cheney thinks they need, every single American now driving an economy car would have to switch to an SUV, and everyone driving an SUV would have to switch to a tank. Maybe there's a connection with Iraq, we're not sure. The appalling irresponsibility of the U.S. energy strategy is somewhat captured in Dick Cheney's description of where energy conservation fits in the U.S. energy plan. And what Dick Cheney said was, quote, "While conservation may be a personal virtue, it has no place in a country's energy strategy." Now, hints of Canada setting a different course. The first reaction from a Canadian minister, Woodale of Saskatchewan, who was at the time Minister of Natural Resources. Actually, energy conservation is an indispensable part of the energy strategy of any intelligent society. I thought that was very nice coming from Canada. So we have this monstrosity going on of an energy policy south of the border that wants to use up as much of our oil and gas and every other country's oil and gas as possible, and as much, of course, of the threatened and fragile wilderness of the United States. I shouldn't leave that out. The fight to protect grounds in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge will become even more intense after this last congressional election, and that is, of course, an issue where Canada has always stood firm, because people on the Yukon side of the border are entirely dependent on the health of birds. They draw both their sustenance and their cultural and spiritual existence, really, from the caribou. And though porcupine caribou herds live much of their life on the Canadian side of the border, they only have one maternity ward, calving grounds on the coastal slopes of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So, of course, that's target number one for George Bush after this last election. Now, where is the U.S. on Kyoto? And I think you all know that they want nothing to do with it, but let's just look at the history. Kyoto, as I said in the beginning, is part of a process. That process started with the agreement in Rio by virtually every country in the world at the Earth Summit in June 1992 to accept the following realities: that the threats of climate change are real, that they are caused by burning fossil fuels and by loss of forests, and that every nation signing and ratifying the Framework Convention on Climate Change accepts the precautions and accepts that if we wait for 100% proof, it will be too late, and accepts that we must strive to ensure that emissions in the year 2000 are no higher than they were in 1990. That was signed and ratified by Canada. It was signed and ratified by the United States. Thanks to the first George Bush, I'm never sure how to distinguish these guys. I don't know what's wrong with this family, but they give the kids different initials. So George Bush is not George Bush Jr. and George Bush Sr., so I will distinguish them as George Bush the Elder, the one who was actually elected. George Bush the Elder, the one who was actually elected, made sure that even though the Framework Convention on Climate Change said all the things I just reviewed, it would not contain any targets or deadlines that were enforceable. As George Bush the Elder famously said in the spring before the June 92, he would not attend the Earth Summit if such deadlines were included, because, as he said, quote, "the American lifestyle is not on trial," unquote. So, but it's important to remember, Canada signed and ratified those commitments within. Worth noting in the context of this current anti-Kyoto, what's the rush to ratify? We signed it. We signed and ratified the Framework Convention on Climate Change within 6 months. In that period, Canada played where we really lockstep with the U.S. administration throughout negotiations to Kyoto, which was the third conference of the parties. This is an international treaty which essentially has created its own governance mechanism. It's created its own parliament, if you will, and the parliament of the Framework Convention on Climate Change is called the Conference of the Parties, and anyone that signs and ratifies is a party to decide these important commitments, make them binding, and they are informed by the United Nations panel I spoke of earlier, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's its whole governance system that moves the process. So by the third conference of the parties, US, Japan, a number of other countries together had been playing a pretty regressive role. Canada had been winning these conference of the parties. The environmental community at every conference of the party gives out honorary awards, the dinosaur awards, the fossil of the day awards, and Canada won there for trying to make sure that the Kyoto Protocol had as many what the government calls flexibility mechanisms and what we have called loopholes as possible. We stayed in lockstep. Many of you have heard that Jean Chrétien's advice before Kyoto to the negotiating group was beat the Americans. That's been reported widely. It was because Bill Clinton had phoned Jean Chrétien and said, we need to make sure we come to some agreement. The Europeans are pushing for reductions that are so steep, 15 to 20%. We can't go there, but we have to get negotiations moving. So Canada should go first and offer to reduce your emissions more than below 1990 levels. So Canada broke a bit of the logjam in negotiations, but it was all part of working with the US administration. And in exchange, Canada won the support of the Clinton administration for more loopholes. So we move together, again, in lockstep with the U.S. Canada emerges from Kyoto with a commitment to reduce our emissions by 6% below 1990 levels. The U.S. agrees to go better and reduce by 7% against 1990 levels. And the European nations as a group are moving to steeper reductions still. Now, what happened in the intervening period? Canada, again, with the U.S. playing a very... Then we get George Bush elected. And this is where, for the first time in a decade, there's been any sign, from my perspective, of Canada independent judgment, separate from that of the United States, in the interests of the planet and the community of nations. And it's tough, because what George Bush did in spring of 2001 was designed to destroy forward international action to protect the climate. It was not merely a domestic decision, and it needs to be understood in the context of George Bush declaring war on unilateral, international, concerted action to protect the climate. In the spring of 2001, Bush, having not even warned the woman he recently appointed as head of the EPA, he'd appointed the former New Jersey governor, Christine Todd Whitman. She was off at an international conference reassuring international environment ministers that the United States intended to continue to ratify Kyoto. Back in Washington, George Bush announced that they didn't want any part of the Kyoto Protocol, and hearkening back to his father's statement that the American lifestyle is not on trial, he said, "We will not take any steps that could possibly hurt the American economy." Moreover, his press secretary, Ari Fleischer, clarified that the American was premised on accessibility to cheap fuels. The ability to drive around aimlessly in an SUV is more than just a bad habit, apparently, in the United States. It is the essence of their cultural, political identity. Ari Fleischer characterized the use of SUVs and cheap fuels as an essential component of the American way of life, and closed his quote by saying the American way of life is blessed. So the use of fossil fuels in an inefficient, wasteful, exploitative manner is completely sacred. Well, what's interesting is, what did Canada do? Having been in lockstep with the U.S. administration all along on this, when Bush said, "We're out of Kyoto," within 24 hours, and I can't tell you why, that against all odds, I am deeply grateful to Jean Chrétien, because within 24 hours, he announced Canada will continue the efforts to ratify. Canada will ratify the Kyoto targets. Canada will ratify Kyoto. That was the spring of 2001. They then went through a summer conference of the parties to see if the Kyoto Protocol could be saved. Because what George Bush had done in delivering that blow was to sabotage the survival of the protocol. Because there's not just one country pulling out. What you need to know is that for the Kyoto Protocol to enter into force as a legally binding international agreement, there's a double test. The first thing that must happen is that the protocol be ratified by 55 nations. Now, that's done, more than done right now. The protocol's been ratified by 3 nations around the world. So the second part of that double test was that those that ratify 55% of global emissions of carbon dioxide in 1990. So when George Bush said we're out, with 4% of the world's population, he pulled 25% of the emissions in 1990 with him. So that the only way for Kyoto to enter a massive concerted effort of key blocks of nations to work together to ensure it could be ratified. Why was it that countries didn't want to see the wheels fall off the Kyoto Protocol? Why were the European nations so frantic to find ways to save it? Basically because that's about 10 years worth of negotiations down the drain if you lose it. It's because industrialized countries to move first on emission targets that are real. You don't get the development. And in fact, the protocol was by only industrialized countries first. There was never any negotiating mandate that thought it made sense to try to bring China and India through on the first round of cuts. The Kyoto Protocol targets are geared to 2008 to described in the agreement as, quote, the first budget period. There will be a second, there'll be a third, there'll be a fourth, and that process needs to bring all nations in together. So when Canada commits to ratifying Kyoto, we are doing something more than merely saying we're going to alter our own economy domestically to use fewer fossil fuels. We are also striking a blow for the global climate, for the global planet, for the global community of nations, and we're doing it despite the fierce opposition of the United States. Make no mistake, the Bush administration is not simply standing outside Kyoto and letting it go by. At the last conference of the parties that took place last month, COP'08 in New Delhi, the U.S. delegation, which has made such political hay out of saying they can't sign on to an agreement that leaves China and India out, was actively lobbying every developing country to refuse to accept targets. The U.S. government was working with Saudi Arabia to convince every country they could that they were not allowed to accept targets, pressuring Russia not to ratify. So Canada's support for Kyoto is essential in planetary terms. I also believe that for Canada to remain a sovereign country with control of its own energy resources is essential as a sovereignty issue. I must admit it creates a sense of unreality when I hear to Mel Hertig saying Ralph Klein's taking his orders from Houston, and then discover it's our Federal Minister of Environment, David Anderson, who said it. But it is a good moment, and I think we should encourage our politicians. We must thank people we normally don't want to talk to, and we must weeks to make sure we ratify, and in the next 10 years to make sure we implement.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth May. That was fabulous. Now, we do have a few moments to open up the floor to questions. So if you have any questions, oh, I see you're already lining up. I'll recognize microphone number, is this number 1 over here? Okay, well, to my left, whatever that is. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, Elizabeth. Our good mutual friend, Ann Burroughs, says hello. My name's David Lawton. I live in Edmonton. What's amazing about this whole debate is to see what excuse me, strange bedfellows it makes, and how inconsistent different people are. The regulation are now complaining about it. The people who were against Made in Canada oil prices in 1981 are in favor of Made in the USA, not Made in Canada carbon prices now. But I also am concerned about we want to be inclusive and recognize as much as possible some of the legitimate concerns that people have about Kyoto. One is if we don't make the targets, should we take the penalty clauses, or should we give money to Russian hot air and put it down the sinkhole? And the second thing is that since it was so screwed up, Kyoto was so screwed up in the first round, in that it didn't have a best technology command and control regulation which would prevent capital flight, which is what people are concerned about, and rightly so. How are we going to maintain our influence and act on it in the second round to make sure that these sorts of the stupid parts of Kyoto are not replicated in the second round?
It's a very detailed question, and you have a lot of knowledge on the subject, which maybe everyone in the room won't have. So let me just quickly try to say that Kyoto is flawed as an agreement, but it is the only agreement that moves us forward. The reasons I say it's flawed is that we have created, exactly as you say, the people in whose interests we negotiated flexibility mechanisms and market instruments to appease and to cater to that sort of free market industry corporate influence over negotiations, are now people who are attacking the protocol for allowing tradable permits and so on, things that we never favored but are now part of the agreement. I think it's essential that we split two things apart. One is that ratifying Kyoto now doesn't commit us to any particular series of measures to meet those targets. We've put forward, and when I say we, the environmental movement in Canada through Climate Action Network has put forward numerous studies that show that we can go well beyond the Kyoto targets. We can actually achieve 50% reductions in greenhouse gases by 2030 and hit Kyoto targets along the way, and do it solely through improving our energy efficiency, improving the productivity of each unit of energy. And that, in fact, doesn't involve trading with anyone, doesn't involve setting up a domestic emissions trading system. You don't need to do anything if you want to achieve those targets other than ensure that we plug the leaks in the way we use energy. round of negotiations. I mean, what we desperately need, as much as Russian hot air has been vilified, we need Russia to ratify. Russia's ratification is the last country. After Canada, once Russia ratifies, the protocol enters into force. I mentioned briefly that the U.S. has been pushing Russia not to ratify, offering them money for other things if they won't ratify. We will, and I think there are about what happened to the economies of the former USSR countries, how following collapse and following how capitalism announced itself triumphant, peoples of Russia were abandoned. Now, this is one thing that should be done in terms of equity, is some investment in helping Russian economy become sustainable in environmental terms. So I'm not as upset about investing in Russia, but we certainly don't need to use Russian credits to meet our targets. We can go well beyond them with domestic measures, and we should be proving that and implementing that and showing how we save money while doing it at every step of implementing Kyoto. So we set in place a groundwork of common understanding and public acceptance, and also public support for all the good things that happen when we stop using fossil fuels wastefully. You know, fewer smog days, cleaner air, more people working. Actually, all the federal government studies, you hear all these scare tactics about jobs lost. The 250,000 job loss statistic actually comes from shaving off something in terms of future job gains, but also the same studies show that there'd be 1.8 million jobs created in the same period through Kyoto. So there's always, there's scare tactics are making people fearful. I think once we get experience under our belt, people will be excited about the next round. Okay, which mic now?
We're going to have to actually wrap up. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'm sorry, we are going to have to wrap up with Elizabeth May and move on to our panel discussion. So let's have a round of applause for your fabulous presence here today. Thank you.
So I just had, I missed a point here. I just had one more point to make here. Elizabeth May, especially in near the end, she's talking to this question that she got about the U.S.'s determination to basically kill and make the Kyoto Protocol ineffective because they want to be producing as much oil as possible. And, you know, I mean, maybe it's... when you understand someone's motivation, right? This USA is a petrodollar. They want to spread their influence as much as possible globally. They need every last bit of oil. The system is set up that way. It's kind of obvious, really, what their position is. It's got to change. I mean, currently with Russia and China switching to a gold standard, that's a completely different paradigm. If they really do tie their dollar, their currency to a fixed amount of gold, we have a situation where you can another situation where you're focusing. The system is driving us to focus on efficiencies, and that's something that we want. We want more productivity with the same amount of resources. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. So I think Elizabeth May understands that, but again, she's a politician, right? So she's trying to, she's happy with having enough of a justification for her being there to be there or something. I don't know. I think she recognizes Kyoto as a useless document, and but she's pushes away, she trumpets it anyways, so there you go.